Thank you, Ahmed. First of all, let me start by thanking the South Asia Future Forum for organizing this much needed event. It is necessary to bring together people with different opinions, ideas, and proposals so that long lasting international disputes are resolved through dialogue and discussions rather than bombs, bullets, and barbarity. So I would like to thank Amir for bringing all us together. I'm obviously it's everyone is joining from five different time zones across three continents. And I was earlier saying that it must be difficult for Adil Rajam and Dr. Hassan Abbas for waking up early to be part of this effort. I obviously it's obviously we are seeing each other after a long time also, and I am grateful for that opportunity also. Many years ago, I read somewhere that states behave like human beings because human beings run them. Since the dawn of democracy, it was hoped that people in power would act more humanly than those who ruled with absolute power. It was especially expected of those who have gone through one of the worst heart-wrenching experiences of human history, the Holocaust. Sadly, it seems Benjamin Netanyahu is not one of those men. He is masquerading like a Caligula, the Roman ruler who once said that he had the right to do anything to anybody. Like the lesson of the history that no one learns from history is so apparent in the present Israeli region. We can read again that they have not learned anything from the history. And thanks to modern communication tools, that we had millions like us around the world now know that all the Jews and all the Israelis do not think like Mr. Netanyahu. In fact, they are condemning his actions and his politics. Past few weeks have reminded us once again that the most important lesson of history is that men do not learn much from history. Speaking at the United Nations General Assembly last week, my cabinet colleague and Pakistan's foreign minister began by saying that there are times in history, I would quote Shah Mahmood Qureshi Saab, there are times in history when the decisions of nations are remembered by the posterity. When we do what we do today or cannot do will be recorded in history, he said. One of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, said sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't want their illusions destroyed. Time, it seems, has come to set many illusions right. The history of conflict, first between the Arabs and Israel, and then between Israel and the Palestinians, is complex and convoluted. What stated as a land grab over 70 years ago has now turned into the worst form of apartheid. Gaza currently is one of the largest concentration camps in the world. We in Pakistan know it too well because our Kashmiri brethren face similar situation in the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where India has employed the same tactics that Israel practices in Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And Prime Minister Modi has actually learned many new tricks from Netanyahu, and what he is practicing in Kashmir is becoming more and more close to what Netanyahu is practicing in Israel. How can you kill children, women, and men in Palestine whenever you want? In 1 week of Israeli attacks, over 250 Palestinians have been killed and thousands are injured. One third was women and children. It seems that death and destruction is what Zionist Israelis have in store for Palestinians. Over 50,000 Palestinians fled their homes in Gaza. There is hardly anything left to return to apart from the rubble and ruins. How could you expect the people, young and old, men and women, to forget what is done to them? Not just once, but after every few years. They start a life and Israeli soldiers come and destroys it with impunity. And Israel does it in full view of the world. It terrorizes, it blockades, it strikes, it kills people, and tragically it seems that Israel relishes it. As if saying that it can do it, what others have done to innocent people in the Middle East, shock and awe. This cannot be allowed to go on. especially in today's globalized world, asking the international organizations like the United Nations or Security Council that they exercise their primary responsibility for the maintenance of the international peace and security can be a course, but most probably time has come to unite the people of the world to rise up to create a collective against the torture, the trauma, and the tyranny inflicted upon the poor Palestinian people by the Zionist Israeli state. I'm sure that the global public opinion expressed through social media and the people's protest marches across all the continent have delivered something that the international organizations miserably have failed to do. Since the Israeli aggression is halted for now, it should be our collective responsibility to work together globally to make sure such barbarity, such brutality, such inhumanity, and such insanity is not repeated again by Israel. The world also needs to be informed that there is no moral or military equivalence between Israel and Palestine. How can the oppressor and the oppressed be equal? How can a military occupier and occupied people be equal? It's a conflict between an illegal occupier and legitimate struggle for self-determination. Recalling the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2649 of November 1970 that affirmed the legitimacy of the struggle of people under colonial and alien domination recognized as being entitled to the right of self-determination to restore to themselves that right by any means at their disposal. I will repeat that Pakistan said in the UNGA last week that an international protection force be deployed in Palestine until a lasting peace is found and established between Israel and the Palestinians. If international peacekeeping troops can be deployed in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Far East, why should Israel and Palestine be an exception? Also, Israel be made to allow the international reconstruction and rebuilding effort reach the Gaza Strip without hindrance. And while we ask for the protection of Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, the plight of Arab Israelis must not be overlooked. They are also being lynched and tortured by Zionists and fascist Israeli gangs in the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. And this is the same thing that is happening in India also, where Muslims have been lynched by Hindu mobs for eating beef. And the kind of atrocities those are going ahead. And as I said earlier, the manner in which Prime Minister Modi is running India is actually coming very close to the Netanyahu model of Israel, and this is very unfortunate. Recognizing that the Palestinian tragedy is at the heart of the turmoil and conflicts in the Middle East and remains the principal root cause of the humanitarian and anger in the Muslim and Arab world, anger that breeds extremism and often spawns acts of violence. It is imperative that a just solution for Palestine is found as soon as possible. For all that, people with conscience and humanity must come together to secure a regional and global peace and security. Thank you very much, everyone, for being part of this effort. And again, thank you, Ahmed, for having me here. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Ahmed Ghori Sahab. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I just want to put a few points for the record. There's a lot of talk of ceasefire, of peace, but this is not a war. What is happening in Gaza and Palestine is a massacre. It's a genocide. So you can't talk of having peace between two sides. There are no equal two sides who are at war. There are the Palestinian people, including women and children, who are being massacred by the Israeli state, the apartheid state, and its security forces. So I think we need to have that clarity. And when you have a massacre, you know, the European countries pushed for the UN to accept the principle of responsibility to protect, the R2P principle. And this is the time, and this is what it was intended for, and yet we see nothing happening on it. This is the time, Chapter 7, the UN Secretary General keeps calling for both sides to stop fighting. It's not two sides fighting. And it's no good the Secretary General giving declaratory statements, frankly, if he can't move to operationalize Chapter 7 which in case of an international threat to peace and security, which is what the apartheid state of Israel is doing. It's a threat to international peace and security. And I find it very interesting how the Western world has reacted. You know, our foreign minister got attacked irrationally, that somehow he was anti-Semitic. Given that Arabs are also Semites, why would a Muslim coming from our part of the world even think of being anti-Semitic? But this is the narrative that the Western world is selling, that, you know, you ridicule Islam and abuse our Prophet, peace be upon him, and spread Islamophobia, and then you claim this is all freedom of speech. Then when we highlight Israel's, I quote from our foreign minister, deep pockets and influence of the Western media and government, it gets labeled anti-Semitic. You massacre the Palestinians and claim the right of self-defense. The time has come to reject this absolute nonsense, this false narrative. Enough is enough, frankly. That is what my message is. Enough is enough. We cannot be bullied or blackmailed by such narratives, because we in our part of the world don't bear the burden of the history that the West is trying to shift on our shoulders. We don't bear the burden of what happened in World War II, what the Nazis did in Germany. That's not our burden to bear. Don't shed it on us. Accept what you did. And you want to make amends, but not at the expense of the massacre of the Palestinian people. That's simply not acceptable. Israel is basically an occupying power. I was reading the South Asia Future Forum's sort of context, where they said the possibility of from suspension of hostilities to sustainable solutions. You cannot have a sustainable solution, you cannot have peace when there is an occupation power that is occupying a particular territory. The occupation must end for there to be peace, or meaningful peace at least. Apartheid is a crime, and everybody knows it, against humanity under international law. And as per its constituent elements in the Rome Statute, it's very clear that the system that exists is one where there is an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over the Palestinians. Also, the systematic stripping of civil and political rights of the Palestinians by the apartheid regime is clearly done with the intention of maintaining that system of apartheid, that system of oppression, and that apartheid regime in power. And it's actually quite horrifying that here we are in the 21st century and we have genocide and ethnic cleansing taking place. We have learned no lesson. The Europeans have certainly learned no lessons of history, and the Israelis don't want to learn the lessons of what is part of their history after all. And the worst part is that those who are perpetrating the crimes are live tweeting their war crimes as achievements from the social media accounts of the Israeli Defense Forces. The settlements themselves are a breach of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits forcible transfers and mass deportations at the individual and collective level. So, you want peace, you have to end the occupation. How does one push Israel into doing anything it doesn't want to do? I mean, on any issue. Look at the nuclear proliferation issue. We discuss everybody's nuclear programs. I was at the IAEA once, and I just happened to raise the issue that if you're talking about proliferation, what about Israel's nuclear weapons program? And everybody hushed silence. No, we don't discuss Israel's nuclear program. Why? So there is this special tolerance of Israel's repression, Israel's oppression, that gives Israel a sort of, I can do what the hell I like because nobody is going to be able to stop me. So the first thing that the world needs to do, the international community needs to do, is, yes, place sanctions on the state of Israel for the massacre of the Palestinians. There should be international tribunals set up to look at the massacre that is taking place, the violation, the war crimes committed by the state of Israel. These things have to be put in place if we want to move forward towards genuine peace in the region, which will at the end of the day only come when there is a Palestinian state to which the UN has given its consent and its support. So it's something that the international community has accepted, to have the two-state solution. But you can't have one state armed and killing and massacring Palestinians and the world saying, let's have peace, let's not have any more hostility. What peace are we talking about? There was a farce of a ceasefire, barely lasted a day. And the interesting thing now is that Israel is not only massacring the Palestinians, it is now deliberately targeting Islam as a faith. Because when you go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramzan and you cut off the azan, the call for prayer, that's an attack on the faith of Islam. When you don't let worship break their fast in the courtyard of Al-Aqsa Mosque, that is not just an attack on Palestinians, it is an attack on the faith of Islam. So what the Israelis are doing now is not only trying to eliminate all presence of the Palestinians, but also to try and remove all signs of the faith of Islam. And that is even more dangerous. So the time has come, all those Arab states, the Muslim states who have recognized Israel, to at the very least suspend that recognition. You cannot have trade. You cannot have visitors coming and going between Israel and the Arab countries and then expect that Israel will fall in line with international law, will stop the massacre of Palestinians, and will behave like a responsible state rather than a rogue state, which it happens to be at the moment. So if we are serious about peace in that part of the world, begin with sanctions, UN sanctions against Israel, begin with those states that recognize Israel to suspend that recognition, end all trade and exchanges with Israel, isolate Israel. It can be done. It's not that it can't be done. And at the end of the day, to ensure that this massacre of the Palestinians is stopped, you will need an international force there. This is an idea that Pakistan has floated, that Turkey initiated, and I think we all need to push for this idea that there must be an international force to prevent the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians by the apartheid Israeli state. Unless we take concrete measures, we are going to find no solution. We are going to find continuing violence against Palestinians. We're going to find the rogue state of Israel continue its policies because they get a message that nobody's really going to stop them or be able to stop them. They have to be taught the lesson that the international community will not accept Israeli rogue behavior and apartheid policies which are resulting in the massacre of the Palestinians. And of course, what the Muslim states must do is break the blockade of Gaza, to send humanitarian supplies to the people of Gaza and break that blockade, which is stifling the people, denying them basic food and medicines. So these are actions that can be taken. It's not something that can't be done. And if it is not done, we've seen what appeasement did. We saw what Munich did. It led to the Second World War. Are we going to repeat that history all over again? Will we allow Israel to be this spoilt brat, this rogue in the international community that cannot be contained because it has a lot of economic and it has a lot of backing from the United States of America? Will the international community continue till every last Palestinian is dead, till the faith of Islam is wiped out from Jerusalem. If that is what we are going to accept, then we may as well put our hands up and say, okay, that's what's going to happen. But we're not going to allow that to happen, because the Muslim people will not allow their governments to just continue putting up with what Israel is doing. So I hope that the Muslim Ummah will be more motivated, will come together in a stronger way and implement some of the suggestions that Pakistan, Turkey, and other countries have been initiating, and begin by ending or at least suspending diplomatic relations. That's the very least that Muslim states can do vis-a-vis Israel. And I hope that the international community at some stage will find its conscience awakened enough to deal with the plight of the beleaguered Palestinian people, including women and children, especially in Gaza. Thank you very much, Ghori Saab, for this opportunity to give my views. And I really appreciate it, and be interesting to see how what would be the final conclusions of this webinar. I may have to leave a little earlier. I have another commitment, but I would get listen to the whole debate later on online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Islamabad. And in the name of the Almighty, the Lord of all mankind, a warm welcome to all the international guests also, and also the Pakistani colleagues. And Ghori Saab, you mentioned my role as the editor of the Muslim. I'd like to mention that one of the best and the brightest wizards, young wizards in the Muslim in those days was a young man, a lad of 17 called Adil Najm, who was a cricket specialist. And I'm glad to see Dr. Adil Najm now emerging as a public intellectual, as an authority, and based in Boston. So it's a pleasure. I'll just be very focused because a lot of things have been said by the two preceding speakers. One of my successors as Information Minister, Mr. Fawad Chaudhry, and Dr. Shirin Mazari was also, I have the pleasure of launching her in journalism because she was also one of the Muslim ladies. I won't say Muslim boys because she was a Muslim lady in the sense of she was a correspondent in New York, and we didn't censor her, although it was the days of General Ziaul Haq. So you can see Muslim has been giving birth to a lot of outstanding ladies, and a friend, Dr. Malia Lodi, also emerged through the Muslim. I think the topic is very interesting. I'll just come to the point. I think the recent 11-day, this war of Israel against the Palestinians has been quite a humbling and chastening experience for Israel. And this has brought forth some new lessons. I think for Israel also, this was a war with a difference. Despite 11 days of ruthless, barbaric bombing, they could not subdue Hamas. And so that militarily, although Israel is a very powerful state, it's the only nuclear power in the Arab world, they could not militarily subdue Hamas. And you can see that today Hamas, along with Hezbollah, have emerged as the two focal points of resistance. And both happen to be non-state actors, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in occupied Palestine. So this is also extremely important. And I would say that morally, politically, legally, Israel lost this war. This is this conflict. So that is very important to understand. Secondly, I would also say that, and Dr. Shirin mentioned that, the spark which ignited this current round was religion, Al-Aqsa Mosque. That was the turning point. And this is after 1969, when there was a desecration of Al-Aqsa, which is one of the holiest sites for the Muslims, and which we term as our Qibla Awal. In 69, that led to the formation of the OIC. So after a long time, when Israel deliberately desecrated the mosque, you could see that this sparked off this conflict. And also, we can also see that there was a sea change in global public opinion. I think probably the biggest mass mobilization of public opinion, not in the Muslim world, sadly, but mostly in the West, after the Iraq war mobilization of 2003. You can see the demonstrations in London, in New York, in Michigan, in Madrid, in Paris, in Berlin. So there was an outrage. And this outrage was also reflected in global public opinion. So this has been some new experience. And for Israel, this was it became a 3-in-1 for the Palestinians resistance. Jerusalem, Gaza, and inside Israel also. Please do not forget that Israel has a population of 9.3 million. And out of those 9.3 million population, 21% is Arab, mostly Muslims. So within Israel, you could feel that impact of the struggle, that for the first time there were clashes directly between Jews and Arabs, mostly Muslims. So I think that this is something new and different, and Israel has not experienced this kind of situation before. And we can also see one consequence which is happening also in neighboring India with Modi, who also shares the fascistic mindset with Netanyahu, that when you play the religion card as a majority against a minority, and religious extremism card, and based on discrimination, based on demonization, based on attacking Muslims, there is a blowback, and there's been a blowback within the community. And interestingly, in the last Israeli elections, so-called Israeli Islamist party has emerged, the Ram party, which is now a factor in the Knesset. So I think these are important lessons. When we come to the situation, I think we should look at the future. The occupation has now become a bleeding wound for Israel. This is now unsustainable because it will bleed Israel from within its own society and within the occupied territories, whether it's the West Bank or whether it's Gaza. So in that context, I think what needs to be done, I would say that there should be steps taken which should include what has already been referred to, an international protection force, which is called by Turkey and also Pakistan, whether under UN auspices or any other international auspices. Breaking of the blockade in Gaza. I was in the debate on Palestine yesterday, and I was one of those who drafted the resolution also on Palestine yesterday in the Senate. There are a lot of Pakistanis who want to send relief goods. And I think it's good that Egypt has opened the Rafah crossing, and we are also looking forward to sending relief goods. And already there are offers made. And then I would say that one important consequence of this conflict, 11-day conflict, has been that Hamas has emerged as a very legitimate political stakeholder in Palestine. And I would say it is the sole legitimate voice of the people of Palestine, at least in Gaza. And as compared to, frankly, the Fatah leadership, which is holed up in Ramallah under Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, Hamas has credibility, Hamas has popular legitimacy. And I think it's important to give recognition. I'm glad that the UN Special Coordinator had a meeting with Hamas leaders, and Hamas's leader, Ismail Haniya, who's based in Doha in Qatar, also had a meeting with the ruler of Qatar. So there is a certain legitimacy, and that recognition should be there. And Israel also should consider having direct talks with Hamas, because this kind of situation, that indirect talks, whether the Americans are talking to Mahmoud Abbas, Israelis talking to Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, while in Gaza they're treating them as so-called terrorists. This will not work. And also, I feel that the time has come to focus on the status of Jerusalem. It is a very important issue. It is the spark that ignited this conflict, and the international community has to be serious of the situation. So if there is seriousness of the international community, a focus should begin, revert back to the UN resolutions, which talk of an independent state of Palestine side by side with the state of Israel, and sharing the capital of Jerusalem. Otherwise, this will become just another lull before another storm that is bound to emerge in the occupied territories. And slowly but surely, it will start engulfing Israel, as it did for the first time. Even if 12 Israelis were killed by rockets from Gaza, even if there were riots, and one of the Israeli mayors said this is like a civil war, as he said, inside Israel. So I think that Israel should read the writing on the wall. This kind of situation cannot continue indefinitely. We have seen that size does not equal strength. Might is not right. Otherwise, the Americans would not have lost the war to the Afghan Taliban. They are leaving Afghanistan as a defeated army. And despite India's occupation of Kashmir, the spontaneous, popular, indigenous uprising of the Kashmiri people continues. despite the highest soldier-civilian ratio in modern warfare. For every one Kashmiri, there are a number of troops of the Indian, almost 1 million troops in the valley. So you cannot go against the course of history. And the time has come for the international community, for not just the Muslim countries, to put pressure. And it's Israel's own self-interest that they see the ground realities and move accordingly. Otherwise, like Kashmir in South Asia, Israel-Palestine conflict will be the premier flashpoint in not just the Middle East, but in the world at large. I'm grateful to Amar Ghauri Saab and the South Asian Futures Forum for taking this initiative. I think it's important to talk to each other rather than at each other, and then continue this communication with the intention of finding a viable, reasonable, just, and peaceful solution according to UN resolutions. Thank you.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I think this conversation between us all is very important, and I'm very happy to talk to ministers and other very important people from Pakistan and from Palestine. I think it's extremely important in order to solve our conflicts. Not with everything was said, I agree, but I want to say basically that I think that there are many things that we can agree upon. First, I want to say few sentences about the clashes in the last 2 weeks. I was one of the protesters in Jerusalem, and I agree that East Jerusalem is occupied by Israel and we have to share Jerusalem. And I was very sad to see what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque. 300 people were injured. And I want to say that sending missiles to civilians is a war crime, and it is not important who is doing that. Palestinians who send missiles to civilians made a war crime, and vice versa. I'm very sad with the fact that about 250 Palestinians, including more than 60 kids, including dozens of women, were killed in this war. I'm very sad about 13 people in Israel who were killed in the war. And by the way, I want to mention that the missiles of both sides, by the way, they don't differ between women and kids and men, and they don't differ between Palestinian citizens to Jewish citizens of the State of Israel. And among the people who were killed were Palestinian citizens of Israel that were killed out of Hamas rockets from Gaza. And they don't differ. One of the women who were killed from the missiles was a woman from India. She was not an Israeli, and 2 were people from Thailand. They were not Israelis. So when you send missiles or bombs, and I'm saying that to both sides, you don't really know who is going to be killed out of that, and that's why we don't have to do that. Of course, there is difference. I'm not saying that there is asymmetry. There is difference between Israel and Palestine because Israel is stronger. I don't think Israel is worst. I don't think Israel is better. I think Israel is stronger and using the power more than the Palestinians because Israel is stronger. And that's why Israel has responsibility for that. Now, I think that we do share the same values and the same thoughts. I saw you mentioned the Islamic movement in Israel that is now very important. And in a way, you know that we want now to form a coalition. I don't know yet, but probably if we have a coalition, they will be part of the new coalition. And then they have what to say. And he did say that they, of course, are very sad of what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque, but they did say that burning synagogues, like we saw in Israel in the last 2 weeks, 9 synagogues were burned out by protesters, by probably, I don't want to, probably it were not Jewish citizens of the state. The head of the Islamic movement visited in one of the synagogues that was burned and said, okay, we have to do our best to recover, to take responsibility for what happened. And I think that all of us, Israelis, Palestinians, Hamas, Fatah, right-wing, left-wing, international community, have to take responsibility in order to solve this conflict. And in order to solve this conflict, I want to start with the fact that here in this land live Palestinians and Israelis, and all of them, Palestinians and Israelis, of course, from all religions, Muslims, Jews, Christians, whatever, Druze, whatever, all of them need human rights, need equality, freedom of movement, and right for self-determination. And the Jews have the right to live here, the Palestinians, the Muslims have the same rights, not more and not less. Israel has the right to exist in 67 borders, and Palestine has the right to exist, not more and not less. And this is why I support the API, the Arab League Peace Initiative, which basically says the Arab nations want peace and normalization with Israel if Israel withdraws from the land it's occupied in 67 war and find agreed and just solution to the question of refugees. And I'm very happy that it was actually adopted by the 57, I think, Islamic states, including Pakistan. So for the future, I think we share, not all of us in Israel, yes, and not all of us in Palestine, by the way, but me and you, we share the same values: peace, equality, freedom. We want to see independent Israel and independent Palestine live together in peace with the support of international community, with freedom to all the citizens to move and to any other right of human rights. And I think we should focus our activity in pressing for that, and in Israel, while we have a large Palestinian minority, we have to secure the rights of the minority, and we have to secure partnership between the minority and majority. I don't know if you know, for example, in my party, we have a third Palestinian representatives in the Knesset and 2/3 Jews. So it's a kind of cooperation in spite of the fact that the Palestinians are only 16% of the voting power. They have even double that in my party, and I think this should be model to life of the shared societies in Israel. So thank you very much for inviting me. I said in advance that I will have to leave soon. I will listen later, and I am still listening in the coming minutes before I have to leave. Thank you very much.
I would like first and foremost to thank you very much for inviting me to this forum to speak, and very much second the idea that different voices with different views, all I think aiming to see how we can get to peace, or first and foremost get to some sort of form of healing in between Israeli and Palestinians. And like Mossi, I didn't agree with everything that was said, and we're not going to sort of nitpick, but I think that the idea is that we really want to see how we can move forward from this situation. I agree that these last 11 days highlighted the fact that the situation is absolutely disastrous, and there's an absolute urgent need for the international community to help Israel end the occupation, but that will happen in stages. And when we come to discuss what kind of international forces we can deploy, first there are a lot of different international missions already on the ground. There's UNSCO, the United Nations Special Coordinator, UNICEF. The UN has at least 5 missions present. There's a monitoring group for Hebron. There's monitoring in the north. First and foremost, we need to monitor the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. I second the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee who suggested that there should be direct talks between Israel and Hamas. I think that that would be a very good idea. There's obviously indirect negotiations, and there are lots of unwritten rules to the game. So this war just highlighted that the situation is untenable and we really need to move towards peace. Now, Mossi didn't speak too much about the current government negotiations because, it's not so clear where it's going to happen. But I just want to highlight that the deadline for the opposition leader in the Israeli Knesset to try to form an opposition government, which would include the Islamic Party, as he said, is the 2nd of June, so coming up very soon. And they're trying very hard to do that. So I think following internal Israeli politics, some of the previous speakers mentioned Israel as one voice, as if everybody in Israel was pro this terrible oppression. Well, it's very far from the truth. There are many Jewish Israelis who are fighting day and night to end the occupation. Mossi was saying that he protested. He wasn't alone, and the country is very divided. And this divide and rule and the incitement to violence have also cost, in 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's life. He was killed by an extremist Jew, as you all remember. So the incitement cuts across different realms. There's incitement against Palestinians. There's also incitement of right-wing Israelis against left-wing Israelis. And of course, there's the rift between Hamas and Fatah, which I think deserves attention. There was mentioned before that Hamas is the sole legitimate leader in Palestine. I beg to differ. Elections should be held. Mahmoud Abbas had postponed the elections. We won't get into all the reasons here about why he postponed them. But I think elections need to be held, and Palestine will then, they will then have to work how they work. I think in terms of the kind of international involvement that we would like, that I think would be helpful to see, is more dialogue and more support. I don't think that radical statements are going to help necessarily. I think we need to see what kind of government is going to be formed in Israel, and if an opposition government is going to be formed, that will be really a time for a change for in terms of the role of Pakistan and the Organization of Islamic Countries. I think it will be a fantastic time, actually, whichever government is going to take place. I think the Arab Peace Initiative should be the model for continuing. And I think the Islamic states can do a lot more. This is all the a lot more to support the Arab Peace Initiative, which will allow for 2 states to live in peace along the 1967 borders. So I think I'm out of time. I'm happy to elaborate upon the various proposals, but in short, it needs a staggered approach, a conciliatory approach. You need to have different kinds of international engagement. There's different kind of international engagement that this particular conflict needs. We need healing between Hamas and Fatah. We need healing, and we need the world to come together to support a 2-state solution. Divisions are unhelpful. Inflammatory statements are unhelpful, in my opinion. But I do think that there's a lot of work that we can do together. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I came very late, so a short statement on the Iranian position towards the Israeli-Palestine conflict, because we talk about Netanyahu policy, challenging internal opponents. But I think one of the characteristics of Netanyahu policy in the last decades is to use Iran also as a pretext to repress and to have this security approach towards the Palestinian question. So I think there is a convergence of interest between hardliners in Iran, who see the last conflict as a revenge after the killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a nuclear scientist, by a Mossad covert operation inside Iran, who was a failure for the security services of Iran. So they can oversell now the capability of Iran to send technologies to Hamas and Islamic Jihad as a way to portray the Islamic Republic as a powerful regional power, the only one defending the Palestinian cause. This is the difference they want to make with UAE, Bahrain, and to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia, who were supporting the Abraham Pact under the Trump administration. So I think it's a propaganda opportunity for the Islamic Republic, and also a way to present the event as Iranian action after the killing of nuclear scientists. But there is a problem also this is for internal use, but for what's happening in Vienna now, the nuclear negotiation, is that the attack against Israeli civilians from Palestine is also difficult sale for the Iranian negotiator not to negotiate the ballistic missile, because the issue of defending Iran, and after the Iran-Iraq war, we all know what happened under Saddam Hussein in the Iranian city, and Iran was victim of Iraqi ballistic missiles. But at the same time, it's very difficult to present this program as defensive, and at the same time to say Hamas victory, Palestinian Jihad victory are Iranian victories. So there is a contradiction inside and outside, and the risk for the Islamic Republic elected government of President Rouhani, because this is two different branches, is to have to negotiate the ballistic missile now in Vienna. So there is a challenge now, because the West will pressure Iran even more, I think, after the conflict, the short conflict in Gaza. So this is what I can say from the Iranian perspective. From the French perspective, because I'm in Paris, I would say that since the attack of 2015 in Paris, there is more support to Israel among the French population. Before it was more pro-Palestinian. And now I think the debate, the freedom of speech, even on this question, is a very sensitive issue in France. And I think that the French government is trying to keep a balance between his alliance with Israel and Arab allies of Israel like UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi to a lesser extent, and at the same time to present France as an independent country, a potential mediator, as a difference with the US. But it's more difficult, as we saw at the Security Council, for France to push for a UN Security Council resolution because of the veto from the Biden administration. So I think under Trump it was easier, because the Trump position was so pro-Israeli, pro-UAE, pro-Saudi, that France could have this mediating role. But now under Biden is very similar to what Biden is doing, what France is doing. Thank you.